Here's a situation you might find familiar. So you feel like you're not getting enough done, and so you decide you need to get organized and manage your time better. You sit down and make a timeline with key deadlines, and then you set yourself a timetable for the week, perhaps even planning to wake up earlier to achieve something at the start of the day. Now, this planning always feels good. It gives you that reassuring feeling that you're in control. And maybe it works for a day or two if you're lucky, but then you fall behind. The routine and the deadlines start to slip, and that detailed plan starts to become more of a burden, a demotivating reminder of the standards you're failing to live up to rather than a useful tool. So, in this video, I'm going to share some thoughts and tips on time management for PhD students, but with the caveat that it's really complicated. It's not just about setting up a plan or system and following it, because there are so many complicating factors in PhD research and in life. There are no universal easy fixes, and different people might have different circumstances that affect their ability to manage time effectively. For example, someone who has ADHD might face different challenges to someone who's doing a PhD while working a full-time job and raising kids, who might face different challenges to someone who has no other major commitments but has just been ground down by the PhD and has had their confidence drained. So, I'm not going to pretend that I have perfect solutions, and I'm not going to pretend that I've mastered my own time management, but there are some principles that you can work with and adapt to your own needs. So, one of the reasons why plans often fall apart is that in research, it's often impossible to predict how long something will take. And as a PhD student, you're probably learning new techniques, meaning you're unlikely to do it perfectly first time. And then, of course, there are other factors like equipment breaking down or administrative delays that are outside your control and can delay progress for months. But even when you have everything you need, including a lot of skill and experience, experiments or research in general rarely works the first time around. And some things, even if you do everything right, never work at all. And this is just what happens when you push at the boundaries of knowledge. But when planning, we tend to guess the minimum amount of time, assuming a perfect version of the future where everything goes smoothly. And while some tasks, routine procedures that you've done many times before, might be predictable, many of the most important research tasks, so the ones that lead to new breakthroughs in your research, simply aren't. So these two types of tasks need to be treated differently. For the routine tasks, you can just make a checklist and follow the steps. And once you've done it a few times, you'll know how long it takes, and you might even get quicker with practice. But not everything is routine, and we also have to allow for the inherently unpredictable, chaotic, messy nature of academic research. We have to allow for mistakes and delays and dead ends and let go of the idea that we can make a perfect plan and stick to it. We also need to let go of the idea of doing everything as fast as we can, because you're never going to be able to do your best work this way, and things often end up taking longer when you rush them. So instead of thinking in terms of a to do list where you aim to complete a task within a set time, it might be better to plan for problems to work on. When you do this, the goal isn't necessarily to solve the problem straight away or guess how long it will take. Instead, it might be better to Simply try to understand the problem, because it's often only when we start to work on something that we really begin to appreciate what's required. You can then think about different approaches and try different ways to solve the problem, accepting that some of the things you tried might not work and that you might have to go through several false starts before you can make real progress. Now, if we accept that many of the things we try won't work, and that mistakes and dead ends are both necessary and unavoidable, then we also have to accept that much of the time we spend working won't be measurably productive or produce immediate results, and that's okay. The goal should be to spend time on a problem, whether or not it's productive, focusing on the process and doing the work to the best of your ability without overly worrying about the end result. No matter how carefully you work, you will face problems, but what matters is how you react to them. So you might be tempted to switch to work on something else in order to stay productive. And this might work in the short term, but what happens when you face another block in that other task? Do you switch to something else again? This would guarantee that you stay busy, but without actually solving any of the problems that you face. It's a guaranteed recipe for overwhelm. Or maybe, instead of switching tasks, you go online because you aren't sure what to do. And this was my habit or my coping mechanism through most of my PhD, but checking email, no matter how I justified it at the time, was just a way of avoiding the issue. But then towards the end of my PhD, I started taking walks around the university campus whenever I faced a problem in the lab, just to give myself time to think. Now, this wasn't productive time in the traditional sense, but it was one of the key habits that ultimately saved my PhD. Staying engaged with the problem, but in a relaxed way that allowed me to slow down and think calmly and creatively. Now, you obviously don't have to go for a walk, but I do think it's important to slow down and give yourself time to think instead of rushing on to the next task or distracting yourself online. So, if you set aside time to work on something, just try to stay with it, at least beyond that initial discomfort. Even if you're not being productive, you're giving yourself a chance to figure it out. Now, slowing down to think about a specific problem in your research means temporarily shutting out all of the other things you could be doing. You will always have competing demands on your time, and you will always have other things you could be working on. But you can only ever really work on one thing at a time. But as you work on one task, whatever you've decided to prioritize, your brain will probably try to divert you to something else, especially in those moments when you're not sure what to do. So, one trick that I found useful is to keep a notepad next to the computer and make note of all the times I'm tempted to do something else. So, let's say I start working at 9, and then by 9:01, I want to check email. I'll write down 9:01, tempted to check email, and then turn my attention back to the work. Then at 9:02, my brain will tell me that I urgently need to go online and look up how to make sourdough bread. But then some of the things I think of might actually be important. But again, I can just write them down and tell myself it's okay, I will deal with that later. And then gradually, my brain settles. The self distraction gets less frequent, and I can relax into the work. But what if you suddenly realize there's something you have to do right now? Well, then maybe you just have to do it. But it's also a sign that something has gone wrong if you've forgotten about it until the last minute. So, if you find yourself in this situation all the time, where you're constantly putting out fires, it's going to be even harder to manage your time and attention. So, the simplest thing you can do to avoid this is to take time at the end of each day to plan and prepare for the next. This means you always start the day knowing what your priorities and commitments are, and there are no surprises. This alone can make a big difference, but it also helps to think on a slightly longer term basis too and deal with at least some tasks before they become urgent. Now, I fully acknowledge that this is one of those things that's easy to say, but much harder to do. And if you're anything like me, you will want to put things off until the last minute because why would you do something now if you don't have to? Whenever there's no immediate reward for doing something and no immediate consequences to putting it off, it can be really hard to get motivated. But the longer you put something off, the heavier it gets. So by the time something becomes urgent, you've trained your brain to avoid it, and it's even harder to overcome whatever resistance you have. So, one of the best habits you can adopt is to recognize when you're putting something off, something that you keep meaning to do, and make it an absolute priority before it's urgent. Now, if it's a single task or decision that you're putting off, then you can just do it. Or if there are many things, then you can make a list of tasks that you've been putting off and work your way through them. Now, you might have to fight a bit of resistance, but you'll probably find that they get easier the more you do. And it'll feel really good to take those tasks off your mind. But for more complex tasks or longer term projects that you're putting off, you might have to set aside some regular time and make it part of your routine. But when setting up a routine, the most common mistake is to try to lay out a plan for the whole week where every hour of every day is mapped out. But this gives you very little flexibility to cope with the unexpected, and it's also really difficult to stick to. So, it might be better to establish a foundation by focusing on just one point in the day, preferably in the morning, because what you do early tends to set the tone for the rest of the day. For example, right now, I'm trying to get some writing done every day because I want to publish YouTube videos more often. Now, I could say that I'll set the routine of publishing a video every Friday, but it's often better to focus on the process rather than the outcome. And the critical part of the process, the limiting factor, is the time taken to write the scripts. Now, I could say that I'll take time every afternoon to write, but I want to give priority to the task I'm putting off. So, the routine I'm establishing is to dedicate an hour and a half to writing first thing in the morning, focusing on the process and the time spent engaging in the problem rather than the result. So I get up, I make coffee, and I start writing. And if I make that a non negotiable commitment and follow through on the plan early, then I find that I'm much more motivated and disciplined throughout the rest of the day because I'm building on an early win. So instead of having a rigid plan for the whole week, I'm creating a simple routine just for the start of the day. From there, I can add other things. So, for example, I could say that after writing for 90 minutes, I'll go through my emails. But I want to establish that one habitual routine first before adding more complexity. And then, if I slip up in my routine or if it's disrupted, I have a simple, clearly defined routine to go back to. So, a few quick notes here. First, I'm not strict about the start time. So, if I get up 15 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour later, I'm not going to beat myself up about it. I just start as soon as I can. Second, even though I start working on writing straight away, I never, ever just write as fast as I can to get words down. I take my time to think about what I want to say, and most of the time when I'm writing, I'm not actually typing. So the time that I spend thinking isn't measurably productive, but it's essential to solve the problems that arise. I'd also like to say that this is just an example of setting up a simple, regular routine as a foundation. Not everybody has to write every day. And for you, the foundational routine might be that you arrive at the lab and take 15 minutes to go over your plan for the day and gather what you need. Ideally, away from the computer so you don't immediately get distracted by email. Now, all of this might sound good in principle, but what if there's just too much to do? Or what if you have constantly changing demands on your time, making it impossible to establish your own routine? Well, I'd say that the best thing to try to do would be to carve out a little bit of time somehow. And this will often mean communicating with other people and rearranging or renegotiating some of your commitments. So, if, for example, you're doing a PhD while working a part time job, what I would try to do is set clear boundaries where you have clearly defined and protected time when you're unavailable, when your phone is off and you're not reachable by email, so you can focus on your PhD work. If that's not possible on a regular basis, something has to give, whether that's changing jobs to one where you have fewer hours or more flexibility, or just not doing the PhD, which is also fine as an option. And a lot of people are a lot happier not doing a PhD. But if you're raising kids, it's more difficult because, especially when they're very young, sometimes you might have to drop everything. And it might be hard to carve out that protected time on a regular basis. In this case, if you have to just work when you find the time, then it's important to have a very clear priority. You've got to know that if you get an uninterrupted 30 minutes today, this is what you're going to work on. And this will be easier if you've taken a little time at the end of each day to plan and prepare for tomorrow. Because if you sit down and then try to figure out what to do, especially if you're sleep deprived, it's going to be impossible. And speaking of sleep deprivation, this brings us to the issue of self care. So, when the work piles up and you're struggling to make progress, you might be tempted to work longer hours and cut back on sleep and social contact. And to be honest, sometimes that's necessary to get something done, but it just isn't sustainable as a long term strategy. Sleep and social contact are fundamental to good mental and physical health, which are also important if you want to do good work. PhD research is cognitively demanding, and if you're exhausted and miserable, then it's going to be extremely difficult to think clearly and solve the problems that arise, meaning everything will take longer, which in turn might tempt you to work even longer hours. But sacrificing more of yourself doesn't always increase your chances of success. So I think an important aspect of time management is also protecting some time for self care, social contact, and above all, sleep. So throughout this video, I've talked about how it's often hard to predict how long things take, and we need to slow down and think and try things that might not work. But what if you have a deadline and you have to deliver work on time? Now, the only way to meet deadlines is to narrow your focus and be very decisive about what you're going to do and how. So, effectively, I'm talking about two different ways of working. So, one being very open and exploratory and creative, staying focused on problems but without worrying too much about immediate results. The other being very decisive and prioritizing getting things done on time. This decisive mode also means deciding what not to do. And this can be challenging because you'll probably want your project to be as impressive as possible. But sometimes you have to let go of some ideas simply because of practicality. But this can potentially make your project stronger because it frees up time and energy to do a better job on the essentials. But then, sometimes, even if you simplify, it's just not possible to get it done on time. And if this is going to happen, you'll usually know before the deadline arrives, in which case, it's best to communicate openly with others and renegotiate any deadlines or request extensions in advance rather than leaving it until the deadline has passed. So, I'm going to leave it there. But if you have any comments or questions or any time management tricks you found useful, please leave a comment below. And if you like this video, please do like and subscribe, and also check out my website at phd.academy, where you can sign up for email notifications so I can let you know directly when I publish new videos. And you can also find details of my online academic writing course, which is also linked in the description below. So that's all from me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.